Good evening. The parsha this week is Parshat Chukkat, and we're going to look at two comments that Rashi makes at two different places of this parsha. I wanted to start out with something I saw Rabbi Fran quote, and that is that he quotes in the name of a Hasidic rabbi that at one point, as they were going through some early summer months reading this parts of the Torah, one of the Hasidim approached Rebbe and said, Rebbe, we're looking at all these places where the Jewish people fall short and they're punished. What hope is there for us? And the Rebbe said, please don't feel that way. These are the greatest people. They fall short. It's up to each one of us to try to do the most we can. So I'm a little leery here because I mentioned this in an earlier class, and I just want to repeat it very briefly. We're talking about a 40-year span of history, and we're talking about the Torah oftentimes focusing in on the disruptions of the early stage development of the Jewish people in becoming a people. So that's what we're going to look at today. So I'm going to split the screen, share the screen, and we can look at the two sources, the two sentences I want to look at today. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and to ask a question. Questions are more than welcome here. And if something is not clear, please let me know. Everybody see the split on the screen okay? Is it pretty clear? Move it over just a drop. I don't know if that makes a difference or not. Okay. So the word chok refers to a category of mitzvot in the Torah. There are 613 mitzvot in the Torah. And it refers to a category of mitzvot whose reason or rationale is difficult to understand. So we generally divide the Torah into chukim and mishpatim. Chukim refer to laws that do not readily appeal to our intellect or hard to understand. And mishpatim appear to laws that do make sense. Classic examples: not to steal is a statute of the Torah, which is a mishpat, which is understandable to us, it appeals to our reason. And something like not wearing wool and linen mixed together is a statute of the Torah, which is perplexing to us and seems, to us, to our modern ears, I think it seems supernatural or superstitious or whatever words we might want to say to indicate the fact that it doesn't appeal to our sense of reason. So this week's parsha is called Chukkat, which means we're emphasizing the idea that it deals with in the beginning with a chok, with a law that doesn't appeal to our reason. And it begins, Zos Chukkat HaTorah, and as it says in English here in the top of the handout, the source sheet, this is the statute of the Torah, which the Lord commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel and have them take for you a perfectly red, unblemished cow, red heifer, upon which no yoke was laid. And it's the procedure, a carefully laid out procedure that was used throughout temple times to purify individuals from becoming tamei mate, from becoming impure, the highest level of impurity, which is coming into contact with a dead body. So in general, all the laws of purity and impurity tend to be chukim. They are what we would consider to be above logical reason. So why is this chok? Why is the red heifer? Why does it singled out as this is the statute of the Torah? And the language itself bears a lot of attention. But most of the simplest approach taken by the Midrashim is because there's something inherently contradictory about the procedure for the red heifer. Because the Kohen, the priest who's charged with making the ashes for the red heifer, who starts out pure, becomes impure through making them. And yet the ashes themselves purify those people who are impure. So that becomes the classical inherent contradiction. How can the very process of creating a source of purity in the world create impurity? Okay, that's deemed to
Rabbi,
be the challenge. Yes,
can I ask a quick question of clarification? Why do you translate Chukkat HaTorah as the statute instead of a statute?
Because the phrase Chukkat HaTorah means like the statute of the entire Torah. It's unique, it stands out. It is the chokest, to use a poor crossover of language, it is the most chok of any statute in the Torah.
Well,
And
then how would you say a statute of the Torah?
so we have, for example, Zot Chukkat HaPesach. These are the statutes having to do with the bringing of the Paschal lamb. So as opposed to saying of the entire Torah, you know, these are the statutes, which some of whom defy reason, that apply to the procedure of bringing the Paschal lamb. But here it's identified as the chok of the entire Torah. Okay, hope that answers the question. There is a little bit of a subplot answer to your question also, because the word Torah itself has to do with teaching and explaining. You know, a teacher is called a morah, someone who explains. So when you say this is the statute of the Torah, you're creating a sense of tension that the Torah, which is meant to teach us and guide us, it should speak to us. And we know that things speak to us most readily through our logic and through our mind and through our thought process. So there's a sense of chok and Torah. When you say this is the chok of the Torah, you're hitting two ideas running headlong into each other. That's a different answer one of the commentaries of Rashi asked. Now Rashi takes the following approach. I have the text of the Rashi here in the source sheet. Rashi explains statute of the Torah. Why is this the statute of the Torah? And he doesn't say because it's internally contradictory. He says because Satan and the nations of the world taunt Israel, saying, what is this command and what reason is there for it? On this account, this Torah writes, uses the term chukah about it, implying that it is an enactment from before me. You have no right to criticize it. Now, there's several things to understand here. First and foremost, and this is where the title of this class of influences from within and influences from without begin to play into it. It would seem from Rashi's explanation here that if not for Satan and the nations of the world, if it was just you and me sitting down and studying the Torah, we would read this section of Torah and say, okay, interesting, complicated procedure. You have to take the cow, the heifer, it has to meet certain criteria, it has to be burned in a certain place, it has to be reduced to ashes. I mean, it's slaughtered first, it's not burned alive, it's done, it's slaughtered like any other animal would be. But in other words, apparently, from the way Rashi is laying this out, if it was just us, we would be okay. But it's this challenge from the Satan and the nations of the world taunting us that requires God in giving us the Torah to emphasize the idea that this is the chok of all chukim. This is the statute of all statutes. As someone asked me recently, says, Rabbi, do you really think in the history of the world that any nation has ever approached the Jewish people and said, guys, come off it? What's this thing about the red heifer? Do you guys really believe in that? Said it seems very far-fetched. And after all, we know that in general, when the Torah is attacked from the nations of the world, so to speak, from people who are outside the jurisdiction of the Torah, I don't think they often point to this section of the Torah specifically. So that led me to feel the following thing, that it's because we live in a setting that mocks and scoffs the Torah and our adherence to the Torah. That's what really sets off this process. There's when we stood in purity at Mount Sinai, and we were willing to say, Naseh v'nishma. We said to God, we're not asking you any questions. We don't want to know what's in it. We're not interested in the details. Give us the Torah. We will fulfill it, and we will study it and understand it to the best of our ability. but our fulfillment won't be contingent on our understanding, and it won't be contingent on us first knowing what we're receiving, because we're going to have trust in God as the giver of the Torah, that the Torah is ultimately for our benefit, right? So it would seem that in that state of purity and sincerity, the Torah wouldn't have to introduce the laws of the red heifer with this special introduction. So what happens to us? And what I was thinking is the following, that because we feel this external challenge from the nations of the world, and this is played out in many different ways, like people, a classical question that the Kuzari deals with in his philosophical framework on Judaism is, what's with you Jews? There's so few of you. Most of the world doesn't believe in this stuff, practice this stuff. You're you're less than 1% of the world. Where do you get the gumption to hang on to these beliefs that when you're such a small minority of humankind? So I think that what Rashi's pointing out is like this: as sincere as we may want to be, and as much as we stretch to tap into the attitude of Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will study, that we said at Mount Sinai, the everyday challenges that surround us, and the idea that we are the minority in the world, and the idea that why are we different? That's what stirs within us. And the Torah here is really addressing that challenge from without and telling us this is the nature of the Jewish people. Yes, certain things we can explain to the world and beautifully, the principle of honoring parents, even the principle of Shabbat. We see secular, even ideologies that don't factor in God whatsoever, adopting, promulgating, and supporting such ideas. But certainly an idea like the Paraduma never would. So in a way, that what the Torah is telling us, listen, you live in a setting where the Jewish people are going to have to stand up for the Torah as a minority, as a quiet, small voice amongst all the shouting of the world. To do that, you're going to have to steel yourself. And you're going to have to understand and accept the notion that this Torah that we accepted it with purity and holiness, and therefore we can resist the mocking comments of the nations of the world. And then because it refers to the Satan, the Satan also, which refers to the internal Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, which exists within people, what Abraham Lincoln called our bad angels, or exactly the phrase, I think something like that. So then we have to realize that any challenge from without can become a challenge from within. And any challenge from within that we don't reconcile ourselves to will be further exacerbated from a challenge from the outside. And I think that's an important dynamic for us to hold on to. And then if that's the case, then what is the solution? And Rashi proposes this solution. It is a chok. Don't criticize it. Don't analyze it. You're not going to be able to understand it. And hence we have this tradition that even King Solomon himself, who was deemed to be the wisest of all people, couldn't understand it and was perplexed by it and was troubled by it. But of course, it's interesting to note that King Solomon is also the person who on his lofty spiritual level fell short at a certain point of his life, because he felt that his understanding of Torah was so great that he didn't have to follow all of the rules and all of the details. So I think this is an interesting counterpoint for us to think about. King Solomon is the one who said, it says in the Torah, don't have many wives if you're the king, because with many wives, your heart will be turned away from God. And King Solomon looked at himself and said, that can't happen to me. And lo and behold, he did have many wives, and his wives did on some level lead him astray and create a barrier between him and God. So what this approach to the Torah, this section of the Torah, is meant to have us reflect within ourselves that there are aspects of life in the Torah and our relationship with God and our relationship within our families that are going to defy our understanding. And if we're going to seek to be people that if we don't get it, we reject it, we're never going to be able to maintain or even aspire to reach again the attitude that under which we accepted the Torah to begin with, which was built on the idea that we seek a relationship with God. God's thinking is worlds and universes apart from our own thinking. And our job to do is to forge a relationship with God through adherence to the Torah, which is ultimately something that we can sense, feel, understand, wrap our intelligence around, as well as our emotional makeup, and feel a sense of security and attachment and closeness to God. So I think all this is what Rashi is bringing together in the comments that he has here. Now, there was an old viewpoint about Judaism was, if you believe, you have no questions. And some people even put it, but generally that's not current thinking. Belief doesn't answer all your questions. Belief does give you a way of handling your questions. It does give you a way of emotionally processing your questions. And I think here, the combination of a sense of humility and a sense of the fact that the Jewish people are treading on a tried and true pathway, which has historically been verified as producing greatness in relationship to God and perseverance against evil and representing good. These are the big ideas. So the idea is, it's an enactment before me. It's coming from the source of everything, which is God. Don't criticize it. Don't wonder about it. Seek to understand it if you like, and there are a lot of esoteric explanations, but ultimately fall in line with fulfilling and staying on this pathway, which has borne such great fruit and has given so much blessing to the world at large. Let's look at the next part. The next incident that comes up in Chukkat, it's not the next, there are some incidents in between, but it's the Jewish people need water. Actually, Miriam passes away, she dies. Aaron and Miriam both die in this week's Torah reading. And very famously, though, Miriam passes away, her merit of providing water to the Jewish people ends, and the people complain bitterly, let's go back to Egypt, as we're going to die of thirst here, even at this advanced stage of time. Moshe is instructed carefully by God to take the staff. It's a big question as to why he's supposed to take the staff altogether, and to go out and to talk to the rock, and the rock will give them water. And this is in contrast to the earlier incident at the beginning in Exodus, I think it's in chapter 20 something there, that where Moshe is specifically instructed to take the staff and strike the rock. So we have this incident. Let's look at these two sentences, chapter 20, sentences 11 and 12. And Moshe raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious water, and the community and the beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moshe and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity or to sanctify me in the sight of the Jewish people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. So this is the incident which, according to some opinions, in and of itself prevents Moshe from entering the land. And other commentaries say it was a series of incidents, and this was the culmination of them. Some people quote Maimonides as saying because it was Moshe becoming angry, something Moshe becomes, I think, 3 or 4 times in the course of his 40 years of leadership of the Jewish people. And therefore Moshe's anger at the people, listen to me, you rebellious ones, caused him out of anger to feel as though he needed to hit the rock and not to speak to it. The big question here is this: what difference does it make if Moshe speaks to the rock or hits the rock in the end of the day? What is this idea that the Torah is saying, because you failed to sanctify me, Yan lo he'emantem bi, you did not believe in me, nahakti sheni le'nei bnei Israel, to sanctify me in the eyes of the Jewish people. And again, the endeavor to sanctify God in the world and to sanctify God's name is a fundamental Jewish idea. So again, let's turn to Rashi. Let's look at this for a couple of minutes and just clarify a few things. Rashi says something that is really unusual, and I don't think any of us would come to this on our own. And can you see the source sheet? And is it clear in center? Rashi says, to sanctify me, for had you spoken to the rock and it had brought forth water, I would have been sanctified before the whole congregation, for they would have said, look at the case of this rock, which cannot speak and cannot hear and needs no maintenance. Yet it fulfills the bidding of the omnipresent God. How much more should we do so? So there's a certain logic here that Rashi is reading into the text. And it's not a simple logic, but the logic is very powerful. If I see with my own two eyes that someone or something that owes nothing to God, as if there would be such a thing, and that's where a rock is a rock. We think of, we use it in English too, don't sit there like a rock. We sometimes say to our students when we feel a touch of the frustration that Moses feels here towards the Jewish people. So the idea is God created this rock. It's been sitting here since creation. It's minding its own business. Moshe says, rock, bring forth water. The rock says, yes, that's what God wants me to do. I'm ready to do it. So then we, the Jewish people, would think, wow, look at that rock. It's not dependent on God. It's not interacting with God. It hasn't been redeemed from Egypt. It hasn't been eating manna from falling from heaven. It hasn't seen 10 plagues happen on its behalf. And yet it steps forward to fulfill God's will. How much more so should we do so? What do you think about this, Rashi? Does it speak to you? Does it not speak to you? Please unmute yourself. I'd love to see what people have to say, or any thought that you have. And that, of course, compares to hitting the rock. I mean, it's the same rock giving out the water, but I guess the idea is simple, that if you hit something, it does what you want. It's not complying, but it's capitulating. So that's obviously a pivotal point in what took place there.
But isn't it also that was an act by Moses as opposed to a spontaneous act by God?
Okay. But so, good point. Excellent. Good question. Then why did Moshe have to speak to the rock?
Yeah. But clearly he wasn't.
I think we've all heard.
Yeah.
I think we've all heard our spouse at times say to us, please do this. And I would think by now I wouldn't even have to ask you. Right? So, if our spouses can demand that of us, it has the next gear in terms of compliance and concern. But okay. I want to make some connections here, and I think I can go in a couple of different ways. So, this is where this class has confused me a little bit. Let me first pull back and say the following thing. Let's look at the first incident, which happened soon after the Jewish people left Egypt, of Moshe hitting the rock, as compared to this incident of hitting the rock, which comes right at the end of the 40 years of the Jewish people being in the wilderness. And this is the way this person, Rabbi Pear, describes it. He says, the Jewish people saw Moshe use the staff in Egypt to raise it up and to bring down plagues on Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. So that when they found themselves in a position where they needed water, they saw Moshe being able to use that same staff that could be used to punish or to demand capitulation, used on their behalf also to get the rock or the world to yield water for them. That was a lesson for them. And he adds a thought parenthetically. But the Jewish people also saw that it didn't really work. Why? Because Paro, who had been so beaten down through the 10 plagues by the consequence of his recalcitrance, and seeing the staff over and over again rain down plagues upon him and the Egyptian people, Paro still changed his mind afterwards, and came chasing after the Jewish people to destroy them, and hence there was the splitting of the sea. So there's a message there that gaining capitulation never leads to lasting allegiance and connection. So in an interesting way, with an interesting insight, here's the way he understands this. That at this point in time where it was clear that the Jewish people were going to enter the land very soon, and let's assume even under Moshe's leadership, but they would spread out in the land. They would be farmers, they would be shippers, they would live a much more natural life. What was going to preserve their allegiance to God? It couldn't be a sense of fear or capitulation. It had to be contingent on hearing, listening to the word of God through the Torah and living up to it. I think this is a very eye-opening idea. So at this stage of the Jewish people, coercion becomes anathema to the Jewish people carrying forward the mission of God into the world. And if you think about parenting as an idea, in other words, we know that when our kids are little, we can coerce them. We're bigger than them. They're dependent on us. They have no choice ultimately but to listen to us. But when it comes to as they grow up, and I had that quote in last week's things, Rabbi Sachs said very beautifully that education is leading a child on his first steps in his path of life, so that afterwards he can carry on his own. Or like riding a bicycle, you put the training wheels on only with the idea that eventually they will come off and the child will be able to ride on his or her own into the future. So when Moshe chooses to once again use this stick to hit the rock, Moshe is feeling and or demonstrating that the Jewish people are not where they need to be in order to go into the land and in order to preserve Judaism. And if you think about it, this is a profound idea when it comes to Jewish history in general. There's the Jewish people go into the land of Israel, and they have their ups and downs in their relationship with God, which is very ordinary and natural because God is seeking a very, very strong, close relationship. But at a certain point when the temple is destroyed and we're sent out into exile, which is meant to be an experience to teach us how much we're missing in life and how important our relationship with Hashem is, it has to come from within us, an interest in fulfilling the Jewish people's mission and in maintaining the Jewish people in the world. And that's where I think this understanding that Rabbi Pierre gives us is immensely important. Because at this point in time, the attachment to God has to come from within. It can't be based on hitting. It has to be based on speaking and listening and internalizing and understanding. And that's where the rock comes in. For the congregation to say, wow, we're going to go through history completely dependent on God and our relationship with Hashem. So certainly we need to have our ears wide open to be sensitive to what the Torah is instructing us is the right way for us to be and to do and to behave and to live our lives. And if we let go of that, the truth is, the Torah says, external consequences will push us back in the direction of remind us that we're Jews, remind us that we're distinct from all the peoples of the world. As you know, remind us that God's not willing to just let go of us if we want to walk out the door. But in any event, what it has to activate is something that comes from deep inside of us, and it makes us want to hear the word of Hashem, to listen to the Torah, and to fulfill the Torah. And it can't be coming from the outside of us. It has to be coming from the inside of us. And certainly as parents and educators, we have to aim for this from the earliest possible stage. We have to realize, and that's where all this ink that has been spilled over the idea that Moshe was no longer the right person to lead the Jewish people, that it was a different generation, there was a generation gap. It took somebody like Yeshua. I mean, you could perhaps say that through Moshe's anger with the people, he reverted back to an earlier stage of his leadership and made the misjudgment that, okay, if the people won't find within themselves the temerity to live up to the mission of the Jewish people, then I'm going to revert to taking out the staff and hitting the rock again like I did in the past. And that judgment has to stop, because that's not going to have any future, and it's not going to have any continuity, and it's not going to enable the Jewish people to go forward. I just want to add one more thought, and that really comes from what Selwyn said before. If you think about last week's Torah reading with the rebellion of Korach, it was not an armed rebellion. It was a rebellion based on words, on talking. Korach got up and made a speech. Rav Lachem, you, Moshe and Aaron, you're taking too much for yourselves. We're all holy. He mocked them. He used different verbal techniques to alienate the people from Moshe. So what you see through that also pushes the idea that not only is continuity achieved through an internal connection and can't be achieved through an external connection, or it won't be durable through an external connection. But even in terms of our everyday work dealing with the world, as much as we are afraid of weapons attacking us and of the global situation, we really should understand what we discussed last week, which is that a word here and there, a mocking comment, a denigrating thought really shapes reality to such a tremendous thing. And I think that also is included in what Rashi's saying. Because if the people could just realize and say, Moshe speaks and the world responds. We know, all the nations of the world know, that if you carry a big stick, people listen to you. But we see, in comparison between the Jewish people and the rest of the world, that we don't have the big stick and we endure. And the people with the big stick seem to disappear and fall off the wagon and don't have the same kind of longevity and impact on the world as we do. So again, it's an opportunity, to pick up on what you said. We have an English phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword. I think the contrast here is that the way we process the world around us internally and the extent to which we look within ourselves to find the strength to be good people and to fulfill and live our lives the way God wants us to. That's the extent to which we persevere. And all the rest, all of the external things really become almost irrelevant when the internal remains solid, focused, sensitive, listening, hearing, substantial, responsive, as it's meant to be. And I think those are big ideas that we can get out of the Parsha of Chukkat. So happy to answer any questions or comments.
Rabbi, I've heard it said that, this comes right after the death of Miriam, and that maybe his actions were based on emotions rather than beliefs.
Right. So, right. I mean, Maimonides says anger, which is an emotion.
Yeah. Right.
Anger got the best of him, as it did in different moments. In different moments, the earlier moment that comes to mind was when Aaron offered a certain sacrifice or ate from a certain sacrifice on the day that they consecrated the temple, and Moshe became angry with him, and Aaron was right. I mean, there was no big consequence. But I'm sorry, so yeah. I mean, maintaining a grip on a person's character and emotions is absolutely a requirement for a person to live a righteous life. I mean, if you look back at Korach last week, I mean, he became jealous. He became, he was struck by the idea that he felt that he was overlooked, and unfairly overlooked. And that really impacted his whole interest in supplanting Moshe and Aaron. So these things definitely have emotional sources. I mean, I really tried to add something to the class, but I couldn't get exactly right here. It came from a different part of this week's Parsha, but just to refer to the thought of it, was this idea of a person misinterpreting their experience based on the character of the person. But it's a different topic, and I don't think we should get into it right now. Maybe next year we will.
So, Rabbi, I'm not clear why Rashi attached so much importance to the rock and the significance of that rock in showing as compared to, say, the 10 plagues or the splitting of the sea. In all of those plagues and the splitting of the sea, nature was doing God's bidding. So why is it so important that the rock should be shown to do God's bidding? Is it just the passage of 40 years? Or?
No, but I think it's the stage of development. It's like, and it's a sensitive point you're raising, but in other words, if I were to tell you that I'm making a bracha now, because when I was a little kid, my father yelled at me if I didn't make a bracha, what would that reflect on my relationship with God or my development as a human being? Now, in a certain way, it's a beautiful thing. My father had such a big impact on me. I loved him. He loved me. So, and it is a nice thing for someone to say, I think my father would be proud of me now for what I'm doing, even though my father's left the world. So I want to tread lightly here. But if it was the idea that there was a consequence that, that I remember, a bitter consequence that I'm reliving, that would undermine my sense of connection to God. You see, so I think the point maybe to clarify would be as follows. In the beginning stages of establishing in the minds of the Jewish people that God is the master of the universe, so God used the visual of a strong hand, as we say in Pesach, of physical might conquering anything in front of it. And that might is God's, obviously, not human beings' might, but it's God's might. But at this stage, it shifts to the idea of an internal conviction of seeking attachment to God that needs to be what animates the Jewish people if they are going to live as Jews throughout history, both in the land of Israel and in exile outside the land of Israel. Does that clarify it a little bit? So-
Yes, it does.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. We'll think about it some more, and anybody has any other questions, I'll be happy to make an attempt to clarify further. Thank you very, very much. Everybody should have a
Thank you.
great night.
Bye-bye.
You're right.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
You are now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.